So let's move on to research. Is there anything happening right now in the field of research for radiation and brain mets that would be helpful to know about?
Yeah, there's a lot going on, and I think ultimately this is a good thing for patients. And there's different types of questions being asked, and at a higher level, there are questions being asked. Who needs radiation, who doesn't? Which types of patients may be managed with drugs alone versus with radiation, and this extends a little bit beyond breast cancer sometimes because each type of cancer has its own drug, some of which can work, some of which may not, in the brain specifically. So the questions kind of vary from disease site to disease site, but that's certainly an ongoing issue. And then there's a lot of questions focused on how do we make radiation either more effective in patients who need it to be more effective or less toxic if the radiation has a track record of yielding some side effects. Some examples would include, ongoing studies trying to delineate who really can get away with stereotactic radiation, like SRS or SRT, whole brain radiation. There are multiple ongoing studies on that front. There are studies looking at using radiation with a radiosensitizer, so a drug designed to make the radiation work better. We have a study open at our center on that front where we have patients who have tumors that have historically not displayed the greatest control rates with radiation, and they can receive a radiosensitizer in some of these studies that ideally makes the radiation work better, but doesn't impart some of the toxicities that might be seen if we just increase the dose, for example. None of this has been definitively established, but that's why it's done in the context of the study. I think there's a lot of interest on a separate note, patients who need surgery for a brain metastasis, and this comes up in breast cancer a fair amount because of the historical lack of screening MRIs. In patients who need surgery, when we give radiation after surgery, based on the way it's been done in many studies, which is a single day to an entire cavity, the results have not been as ideal as we would have hoped. More people are recurring in the cavity than we would have expected. The surgery can propagate tumor cells beyond the cavity, and that radiation can't account for that anymore. And then there can be necrosis because you're often radiating a generous size area with a single day of high dose radiation. So there have been a number of studies looking at fractionating radiation, like breaking it up into multiple doses, and those are ongoing currently. And a really exciting concept is doing the radiation pre-op. So giving the radiation and then taking the patient to surgery, with the idea that you're treating a tumor, and even if the surgery disperses some of those tumor cells, they've been treated by the radiation and hopefully are less likely to propagate elsewhere because essentially they're non-viable. This is a paradigm that's used in other cancers, and the question is, can we apply it to brain mets? So there are other exciting concepts as well. There's drug plus radiation concepts, ability of radiation and drugs to work together to manage a given patient. And thankfully, there's more and more studies, being conducted each year. But I do want to emphasize that in brain metastases, we do lag behind other cancer entities with similar incidence. So if you look at the number of brain metastases per year, it's roughly the same as the number of breast cancer diagnoses per year, colorectal cancer diagnoses per year, lung cancer diagnoses per year, or prostate cancer diagnoses each year in the United States. But when you look at research output, whether you measure that in terms of active clinical trials, completed trials, abstracts presented at major conferences, we lag behind in this field. So as much as is being done to promote the health and well-being of patients with brain metastases, there is a even bigger need to do more. So I think this is where we need, patients, nurses, doctors, funding agencies, companies coming together to try to dedicate studies to patients with brain metastases.
That's a really interesting point that you make. Do you have any kind of thoughts on why that is?
Well, I think there's a number of factors to think about. Um, the field has gotten better in many ways, but historically, not only did we not have a lot of trials for patients with brain metastases, but if patients had brain metastases, they weren't even eligible to get a drug designed to look at the effect in the body. And thankfully, we've seen a transition from that to allowing those patients to be on study if they get the tumor treated beforehand, to now what's really exciting is studies testing whether a drug can work in the brain among patients with active brain metastases. And I think that's come a long way forward. But historically, I think funding agencies and companies were a little reticent to patients on their studies because of the concern that the brain would progress while the body remains controlled, and that might not, reflect well on a given drug, or may prematurely terminate a drug from development that otherwise was promising. So I think that's been a historical issue. I think in the past there hasn't been as much attention, given in the literature, to the unique nature of brain metastases. They're different than liver metastases or bone metastases and lung metastases. They have inherent challenges and issues associated with them. And I think increasingly we're seeing more awareness. You're seeing things like dedicated meetings for brain metastases patients. A few years ago, Snow had, for example, the Society for Neuro-Oncology had the first dedicated meeting for specifically brain metastases. And that was a huge success. There are other brain metastases meetings that are upcoming. For example, this year there'll be the first clinical trial tumors, and a lot of those studies include brain met specific studies. So I think that's exciting. It's right, but we definitely have a long way to go in terms of promoting research in this population.
I agree. We do. I wanted to jump back to one of the studies that you mentioned, just out of curiosity, about reversing when the radiation occurs, and that now you typically do the radiation after surgery occurs, and then you discuss that research is looking at doing radiation before surgery. Why would you need to do surgery if you have gone ahead and radiated the tumor? Isn't that just like getting SRS and waiting for it to shrink?
That's a great question. And so this would come up if you've made a determination that the patient needs surgery. And typically you've made that determination based on the most common scenario is a larger tumor that's causing a bunch of symptoms, and that steroids have not yielded good enough effect for. So you've made the determination that the patient needs surgery, and then the current standard is to do the radiation after. Here, what you're going to say is, okay, we understand that. We understand that the radiation is probably not a good long-term strategy by itself, because it's a little more difficult to control a bigger, bulkier tumor. You're giving less dose. These often behave more poorly than smaller tumors. And, ultimately the patient may have symptoms that aren't going to get better anytime soon, if it's just radiation alone. If it's surgery, then you can quickly decompress. So you've made that determination that the patient needs surgery, and then now you're adding the, preoperative radiation piece. But you make a really good point. You could say, like, why not? And then that would typically be for the patient who just doesn't quite need surgery yet.
Makes sense. Yeah, thank you for that clarification.